In 2012, the Norfolk Southern painted 20 brand new locomotives into the classic paint schemes of its predecessor railroads to celebrate its own 30th anniversary as a railroad. The heritage units, as they're known, were not the first of their kind, but never before in the history of railroading had such an ambitious historical project ever been embarked on by a railroad of any scale. Conceived by artist Andy Fletcher and made possible by the vision of then CEO Charles Wick Moorman, this historic project will forever go down as one of the greatest public relations accomplishments in railroad history. Through growth and mergers, the Southern Railway became a 10,000-mile railroad system by the 1970s. And though it began with the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company in 1827, the nucleus of the Southern Railway system was the Richmond and Danville, which was organized in 1847. The Southern itself was incorporated in 1894 from the reorganization of its numerous predecessors and had absorbed no less than 68 railroad companies following the next 6 years. Among them were the Alabama Great Southern, the Cincinnati Southern, the North Carolina Railroad, and the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railroad. More flamboyant, probably because of its Vanderbilt heritage, the New York Central was the vision of businessman Cornelius Vanderbilt, who with his son stitched together a network of railroads reaching from Boston and New York City to Chicago and St. Louis. The combined 11,000-mile system was best known for the ultra-luxurious 20th Century Limited passenger train between Chicago and New York City and the magnificent Grand Central Terminal. Today, the Norfolk Southern portion of the historic water level route between Cleveland and Chicago handles up to 100 trains per day and is its busiest line on the entire system. Upon its completion in 1851, the 446-mile, 6-foot gauge Erie Railroad was America's longest railroad. Following the success of the Erie Canal, New York State chartered the New York and Erie Railroad in 1832 to connect the Hudson River with the Great Lakes at Dunkirk, New York, via the state's southern tier cities of Binghamton and Corning. The Erie was the first railroad to use the telegraph for train dispatching, and the network was standard gauge in 1880 and extended to Chicago. It was renamed the Erie Railroad in 1895, and at 2,199 miles, the Erie merged with the 918-mile Lackawanna Railroad in 1960, whose routes ran parallel between New Jersey and Buffalo, New York. The Central of Georgia was formed in 1833 by residents of Savannah, Georgia, wanting to recapture business lost to Charleston, South Carolina with the opening of the South Carolina Railroad. The 1,944-mile system eventually reached Chattanooga, Birmingham, and Atlanta. The Frisco purchased control of the CFG in 1956 and eventually sold it to the Southern Railway in 1963. 1,400 miles, the Philadelphia and Reading opened in 1839 and dominated northeastern coal transport in the mid-1800s. As a member of the Alphabet Route and other traffic alliances, the Reading teamed up with other railroads for cross-country traffic from the South and the Midwest to the eastern seaboard. A function of its routes between Harrisburg, PA to Allentown and Philadelphia carried out for Conrail and still to this day for Norfolk Southern. The Reading's yellow and green for its switchers and road switchers debuted in 1962. It was a bright departure from the solid dark green on the early hood units. The cab units were always black with the green stripe and gold trim. The B-Line service slogan graced 15 six-axle units built in 1966 to 67 with solid green returning for the Reading's final new locomotive shortly before it entered Conrail. The Norfolk and Western traces its roots back to the 9-mile City Point Railroad created in 1836 between Petersburg, Virginia, and a location on the James River. It became the N&W in 1881 and operated under the control of the Pennsylvania Railroad for a time that started in 1900. Through its takeover of the Illinois Terminal, the Nickel Plate, and the Wabash, the Norfolk and Western became a 7,803-mile system and became a major Midwest railroad player. After the takeovers of the Nickel Plate and the Wabash in 1964, and in anticipation of a proposed but never materialized merger with the C&O, N&W switched its diesel colors from black for its freight units and red for passenger to a dark blue known as Pebbler Blue. This was named after Herman Pebbler, the Wabash CEO who became the president of the N&W. In 1971, the N&W went back to basic black 11 years before merging with the Southern Railway in 1982. From its starting point at the docks of Jersey City, New Jersey, the C&J 700-mile system ran west to the coal fields around Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, Pennsylvania, and south to seaside towns and the sand-producing region of southern New Jersey. The C&J had a giant waterfront terminal opposite Lower Manhattan and in sight of the Statue of Liberty, the railroad's logo. As its Central Railroad of Pennsylvania operation faded, the company withdrew from Pennsylvania in 1972. Among its patents, the C&J was the first railroad to have uniformed employees. In 1925, it operated the first commercially successful diesel-electric locomotive, and in 1929, it launched one of America's first luxury coach trains, the Blue Comet, to Atlantic City. It was also known for its use of camelback steam locomotives, which the engineer sat in a cab with the boiler while the fireman worked in a small shelter behind the firebox. Along with its heavy commuter and local freight operations, for which it earned the nickname the Big Little Railroad, the C&J provided a New York gateway for the B&O and the Reading, which both operated the C&J for a time before Conrail took over the Jersey Central in 1976. Known as the Standard Railroad of the world, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest railroad in the world by way of tonnage, revenues, and passengers carried. Its routes served the coal and steel industrial heart of the 20th century America, and its reach stretched from the Atlantic coast through Pittsburgh to Chicago and St. Louis. Known for world-famous landmarks such as the Horseshoe Curve near Altoona, the Manhattan Tunnels in New York City, the former Penn Station, and today's Northeast Corridor passenger and commuter route, which to this day is the reason Amtrak still survives. The Lehigh Valley Railroad was hands down the most colorful big railroad in America, with a myriad of color schemes during its last 10 years of operation. Founded by Asa Packer, anthracite coal was the 1,362-mile line's lifeblood until it fell into Conrail in 1976. Its main disadvantage in life was that it had the longest of 4 competing routes between New York City and Buffalo, New York, and therefore had to fight for every carload it could get. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western won its claim to fame with Phoebe Snow, an early advertising character whose white gown remained spotless while riding Lackawanna's passenger trains. This was thanks to the clean-burning anthracite coal used in its steam locomotives. Profits from hauling anthracite out of Scranton, Pennsylvania enabled the Lackawanna to super-engineer its 396-mile main line from New York City to Buffalo, New York, and build the largest concrete bridge in America, the Tunkhannock Viaduct in Nicholson, Pennsylvania. Inventor Thomas Edison ran Lackawanna's first electric-powered commuter train in 1930 out of the elegant waterfront Hoboken terminal. With coal and other traffic in decline, the Lackawanna and Erie merged in 1960 to form the Erie Lackawanna, which joined Conrail in 1976. Few railroads have the fanfare and folklore as the Wabash Railroad, thanks to the Wabash Cannonball, a 1904 folk song. Wabash's earliest component, chartered in 1837 as the Northern Cross, was the first steam railroad west of the Alleghenies. Wabash had introduced a cannonball in 1885, then revived the name in 1950 for its daytime Detroit to St. Louis passenger train. By then, the railroad was well known for fast freights that roamed its 2,500-mile system linking the Great Lakes with cities across the Midwest. Its main line from Detroit to Kansas City, Missouri, bypassed Chicago's busy yards and became a favorite of car makers seeking a quick way to ship auto parts and new vehicles across the country, a route still preferred to this day with the last of the road railers on Norfolk Southern. Along with the nickel plate, the Wabash joined the N&W in 1964. Formerly known as the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, its nickname came from the Norwalk, Ohio Chronicle that billed it as the Great New York and St. Louis Double-Track Nickel-Plated Railroad. The NKP stretched from Buffalo, New York to Chicago and grew to be 2,170 miles long between Wheeling, West Virginia and St. Louis before being acquired by the Norfolk and Western along with the Wabash in 1964. Chartered in 1883, the original Norfolk Southern was a 933-mile line that ran from Charlotte, North Carolina, east to Norfolk, Virginia, and Morehead City, North Carolina, and grew through the acquisition of short lines including narrow-gauge routes. The line featured ferries and, starting in 1910, a 5-mile-long wood trestle across the Albemarle Sound. The railroad prospered in the early 1960s with the addition of phosphate traffic. The Southern Railway acquired it in 1974 and merged it with the Carolina and Northwestern under the Norfolk Southern name. In 1981, the name was changed to Carolina and Northwestern so the Norfolk Southern name could be used for the newly formed holding company as part of the Southern, Norfolk and Western merger. To this day, the Norfolk Southern still operates portions of the original Norfolk Southern with short lines such as the Aberdeen, Carolina and Western running other segments. The Illinois Terminal Railroad began its life as the Illinois Traction System in 1890 as an interurban electric railroad in central and southern Illinois, eventually becoming a 484-mile railroad from Danville and Peoria to St. Louis. Hit by the Depression, it was reorganized as the Illinois Terminal in 1937 and attempted to survive as a passenger and freight railroad until relinquishing the passenger business in 1956 when it was acquired by 9 and later 2 more railroads. Because the Illinois Terminal had valuable trackage and customers, they operated the Illinois Terminal as a short line to carry freight to the acquiring railroads. The system's Y-shaped main line stretched from St. Louis to Springfield, Illinois, with branches onward from Springfield northwest to Peoria and eastward to Danville. One of its accomplishments during its independence was that the railroad built freight bypasses around major cities so that it did not have to run freights down busy streets. The Illinois Terminal was one of only 3 U.S. interurban lines to operate sleeping cars and ran them longer than any other line from 1906 to 1940. In 1935, it was the first interurban line to offer air conditioning. The Illinois Terminal continued to operate as a freight railroad until the Norfolk and Western bought it in 1981. Norfolk Southern still runs former Illinois Terminal lines around East St. Louis, Illinois to this day. Contrary to its name, the Interstate Railroad, which was an 88-mile-long coal hauler in far western Virginia, never crossed the state line, but it did come within 2 miles of the West Virginia state border. The Little Railroad was incorporated in 1896 to serve the Southwest Virginia coal fields and was completed in 1909 with a 16-mile line from Stenega, Virginia to Norton, Virginia. In 1913, it absorbed the Wise Terminal Company, and in 1923, it constructed a branch to reach the Clinchfield Railroad. That branch soon became the main line and was under control of the Virginia Coal and Iron Company. Its power consisted of hand-me-down locomotives from the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Southern and a handful of Alco RS-3s. It was acquired by the Southern Railway in 1960. The Monongahela was formed in 1900 as a joint venture between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, with the Baltimore and Ohio acquiring a third stake in 1927. Today, both NS and CSX use the MGA former routes to serve the areas, producing coal with a high heating value used to generate electricity. A 162-mile-long coal hauler in southwest Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, the Monongahela was split between the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, and the Baltimore and Ohio. Pittsburgh and Lake Erie sold its third to Conrail in 1989 before itself being absorbed by the CSX, and the Baltimore and Ohio did the same in 1990, and Conrail absorbed the obscure road in 1992. The 167-mile Savannah and Atlanta began life as the Brinson Railway in 1906, expanding northwest from Savannah. Owner George Brinson completed 43 miles before he ran out of money in 1909, and New York banks took over and completed the line. It reached Kmac, Georgia, and became the Georgia Railroad's primary route between Savannah and Atlanta. It consolidated with other small railroads to become the Savannah and Atlanta in 1917. The SNA became a subsidiary of the CFG in 1951. The Southern took over the CFG in 1963. Except for track sharing, the Savannah and Atlanta stayed independent until 1971, when Southern Railway fully absorbed the property. Probably the best showpiece of Savannah and Atlanta rolling stock is 462 number 750, which pulled Southern and Norfolk Southern excursions from the 1960s through the 1980s. Starting with the Deepwater Railway, Henry Huddleston Rogers then created the Tidewater Railway and combined the two to form the 600-mile Virginian Railway in 1907. The coalfields to Tidewater route was known for its heavy-duty carrying capacity, electric operations, and its gentle route east of Roanoke when the Norfolk and Western acquired it in 1959. One interesting thing to note is that the original Virginian did not have road numbers on the sides of its locomotives, but they were required for Norfolk Southern by the American Association of Railroads. Also notable is that the Virginian is the only major railroad that was created by the capital and credit of one man, that man being oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers himself. Despite their appearance, Penn Central locomotives, like the Pennsylvania Railroad before it, were in fact Brunswick green and not black. The 20,530-mile-long system was America's sixth largest corporation at the time of its forming. Lingering rivalries, operating differences, manufacturing declines, costly passenger operations, and outdated government regulations combined to push the company into bankruptcy in 1970. That was America's largest bankruptcy at the time. Penn Central's dark legacy lasted far beyond its 8-year lifespan, with the Penn Central's collapse helping to pave the way for modern railroading success today as we know it. The Consolidated Railroad Company was formed in 1976 to repair the remains of the ailing railroad infrastructure of the Northeast, combining the Penn Central, the Lehigh Valley, the Jersey Central, the Reading Railroad, the Erie Lackawanna, the Lehigh and Hudson River, and the Pennsylvania-Reading Seashore lines. Conrail took the core of these former roads and saved railroading in the Northeast. Before Conrail's blue paint appeared, there was a Conrail brown on the table, an idea that thankfully never made its way onto a locomotive. Prior to the Conrail formation, a consulting firm was hired to develop a logo, style manual, and paint scheme for the new road. The consultants presented Conrail management with blue and brown. The brown was based on the UPS and Pullman experience, while the blue was chosen because it was unlike any color of a major Class I railroad of the day. The first Conrail diesel to be painted blue was the ex-Penn Central, ex-New York Central GP40 number 3091 in the Collinwood, Ohio shop 7 weeks after Conrail's startup. Half of all of the NS Heritage units came from the Big Blue. The acquisition gave NS Conrail's prize routes linking the Midwest gateway of Chicago with the Northeast United States.